May 29, 1943, 25,000 feet above the French coast. Inside the nose of a B-17F flying fortress, the bombardier stares through a sheet of clear plexiglass. He is the most vulnerable man in the sky. Through the haze he sees them. 4 Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds, wingtip to wingtip, lining up dead ahead. Bandits. 12 o'clock level. This is the specific nightmare of the 8th Air Force. The German pilots have discovered the B-17's glass jaw. By attacking head-on, the fighters and the bomber rush toward each other with a combined closing speed of over 600 miles per hour. At that velocity, the B-17's handheld .30 caliber nose guns are useless. The bombardier has less than 2 seconds to track a target that is spitting 20 mm cannon shells directly into his face. There is no armor plate in front of him, only glass and thin aluminum. The German formations tear through the bomber stream, shattering cockpits and butchering crews before the heavy tail guns can even fire a shot. The losses were unsustainable. The crews were desperate. To fix this fatal flaw, the Army Air Forces didn't just modify a plane. They decided to build a flying battleship. To understand why this monster failed, we have to go back to the panic that created it. That panic didn't start in the cockpit. It started in the pristine, map-lined offices of the High Command. In early 1943, the doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces was built on a single, unshakable religious belief: the self-defending bomber. General Henry Hap Arnold and his inner circle, known as the Bomber Mafia, believed that a B-17 flying fortress was a fortress in more than just name. Their logic was seductive in its simplicity. If you stacked enough bombers together in a tight formation, their overlapping fields of fire would create an impenetrable geometric web of lead. They believed that a properly flown formation didn't need fighter escorts. They believed the bomber could fight its way to the target, drop its payload, and fight its way home, immune to interception. But over the gray, freezing skies of Europe, the laws of physics were declaring war on American doctrine. The reality was that the combat box, the tight defensive formation of 18 aircraft stacked in high, lead, and low squadrons, was failing. The primary escort fighter available to the 8th Air Force was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was a massive, powerful brute of an aircraft, armed with 8 50 caliber machine guns and an engine that could outclimb almost anything in the sky. But the Thunderbolt had a fatal flaw. It was thirsty. In early 1943, without external drop tanks, the P-47 could only escort the bomber stream across the English Channel and perhaps as far as the Belgian border. For the bomber crews, the point of no return became a daily psychological torture. They would watch the P-47 seconds rocking their wings, the universal signal for bingo fuel, and banking sharply back toward England. As the Thunderbolts vanished into the western haze, the bomber crews were left suspended in a terrifying silence. They knew that the Luftwaffe radar operators had been tracking them since they crossed the coast. They knew that the German fighter wings, the Jagdgeschwader, were not stupid. They were loitering just beyond the range of the American fighters, waiting for the sheepdogs to leave so they could butcher the flock. The moment the escorts departed, the horizon would fill with black specks. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds would swarm the formation. And contrary to General Arnold's theories, the Germans had solved the geometry of the combat box. Luftwaffe aces like Egon Mayer realized that the B-17's defensive firepower was heavily concentrated in the rear. The tail gunner, the ball turret gunner, and the waist gunners created a zone of death behind the aircraft. But the front was a blind spot. The B-17F, the standard model flying in 1943, was critically undergunned in the nose. It relied on cheek guns single, 30 caliber or 50 caliber machine guns mounted on the side of the fuselage. These were manual weapons. The navigator or bombardier had to physically wrestle the gun against the slipstream, aim through a ring sight, and guess the lead angle. Trying to hit a fighter closing at 600 miles per hour with a manual gun was like trying to shoot a bullet out of the air with a pistol while riding a roller coaster. The German pilots exploited this ruthlessly. They would climb high, circle to the front of the bomber stream, and dive in a frontal attack. They called it the 12 o'clock high pass. They would line up on the cockpit, hold down the triggers on their 20 mm cannons, and shred the pilots before diving away beneath the formation. By the spring of 1943, the math of the air war had become grotesque. The 8th Air Force was suffering loss rates of 5, 6, sometimes 8% per mission. To the generals in Washington, 5% sounded like an acceptable attrition rate. But to the men in the barracks at Alconbury and Thorpe Abbotts, the math was a death sentence. A tour of duty was 25 missions. If you lose 5% of the force every time you fly, statistically, it is mathematically impossible to survive a full tour. The average lifespan of a bomber crewman was measured in weeks. The morale of the 8th Air Force began to crack. Crews were flying with the grim fatalism of men who arguably were already dead. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th, stared at the loss charts and knew the doctrine had failed. The self-defending bomber was a myth written in blood. He needed a long-range escort fighter. He needed a plane that could fly all the way to the industrial heartland of Germany, targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, and dogfight the whole way back. But the technology didn't exist. The P-51 Mustang, paired with the British Merlin engine that would eventually win the war, was still a year away from mass deployment. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning was tied up in the Pacific Theater. There was no engine efficient enough, and no airframe large enough, to carry the fuel required for deep penetration raids, while retaining the agility to fight. So, in the desperate grinding logic of 1943, the Army Air Forces decided that if they couldn't build a fighter with the range of a bomber, they would simply turn a bomber into a fighter. The logic seemed sound to the bomber mafia. It appealed to their vanity. It didn't require admitting that the bomber needed a little friend to protect it. Instead, they would create a super bomber. They would take a standard B-17F airframe and strip out the bomb bay. They would remove the bombardier's equipment and the radio operator's desk. In place of bombs, they would load the fuselage with thousands of rounds of ammunition. In place of the weak manual nose guns, they would install a powered turret. They would add a second turret on the roof. They would double the waist guns. They would armor the crew positions until the plane was a flying tank. They called it the YB-40. The Y stood for service test, the B for bomber. But this was no bomber. It was a flying destroyer. It was designed to fly inside the formation, looking exactly like every other B-17, a wolf in sheep's clothing waiting to ambush the German interceptors. It was the technological answer to the 12 o'clock high problem. It was the perfect solution. It solved the range problem because it was a B-17. It solved the firepower problem because it carried 30% more guns than a standard Fortress. It was the weapon that would save the 8th Air Force, or so they thought. Because in their rush to put more guns in the sky, the engineers had forgotten to ask the most important question of all. What happens to a heavy airplane when the rest of the formation gets light? The engineers at Vega and Douglas Aircraft weren't looking at the speedometer. They were looking at the gun sights. Under the top-secret designation, Project V, they took the standard B-17F, a graceful, albeit rugged bomber, and began a radical surgery to turn it into a predator. The most glaring vulnerability was the nose. To fix the glass jaw, they didn't just add a gun, they added a robot. They installed the Bendix Model A chin turret. This was a marvel of 1943 engineering. Unlike the cramped ball turret where a man curled into a fetal position, the chin turret was remote-controlled. The bombardier sat comfortably in the nose, looking through a reflex sight. He gripped a control yoke that looked more like a video game controller than a weapon of war. When he moved his hands, the hydraulic motors beneath his feet spun the turret instantly. 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns swiveled in perfect synchronization with his sight. It gave the bomber something it had never possessed, a lethal, calculated response to the frontal attack. But Project V didn't stop at the nose. They looked at the radio room, a relatively quiet spot on the fuselage spine, and cut a hole in the roof. There, they dropped in a second Martin dorsal turret. Now, the aircraft had two powered turrets covering the high 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock approaches. At the waist stations, where gunners traditionally fought with single mounts that jammed when the casing ejection chutes twisted, they installed twin mount, 50 calibers. That's 4 heavy machine guns covering the beam, fed by hydraulic boost motors to keep the heavy ammo belts moving against the G-forces. And that ammunition was the heart of the beast. A standard B-17F carried perhaps 3,900 rounds of 50 caliber ammo. The YB-40 was redesigned to carry 11,275 rounds. The bomb bay, usually the home of 500-pound demolition bombs, became a magazine. The shackles were stripped out. In their place, wood and aluminum racks were bolted to the floor, stacked high with endless belts of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The YB-40 wasn't a bomber anymore. It was a flying ammo dump. To protect the crew, who would be intentionally drawing fire, the engineers bolted on hundreds of pounds of additional armor plating. The pilot and co-pilot seats were reinforced. The bombardier's station was up-armored. When they were finished, the aircraft bristled with up to 16 50-caliber machine guns. For context, a P-47 Thunderbolt, the heavyweight champion of fighters, carried 8. The YB-40 carried double that. It could theoretically track and engage targets from every single spherical angle. There were no blind spots. There was only a wall of lead. When the first 12 of these monsters arrived at RAF Alconbury in May 1943, assigned to the 327th Bombardment Squadron, the crews were ecstatic. They walked around the tarmac, staring at the chin turrets and the twin waist guns with a mix of awe and relief. They nicknamed it the Porcupine. Other crews called it the Flying Destroyer. The psychological impact was immediate. For years, bomber crews had felt like sitting ducks, passively taking punishment while flying straight and level. Now, they had a teammate that could punch back. The strategy was cunning in its deception. The YB-40 was painted in standard olive drab. From a distance, indistinguishable from a standard B-17F. The plan was to mix one YB-40 into each formation element. The German pilots, spotting a formation, would identify what they thought was a standard B-17. They would initiate their standard attacks, perhaps a beam run or a frontal pass, expecting the usual light resistance. Instead, they would fly into a buzzsaw. The YB-40 would unleash a volume of fire the Luftwaffe had never encountered from a bomber. It was a trap, a Q-ship for the sky, designed to bleed the Luftwaffe white. On paper, it was the ultimate weapon. It satisfied every demand of the bomber mafia. It proved that the bomber could evolve. It proved that American engineering could solve tactical problems with brute force. The pilots of the 92nd Bomb Group climbed into their new machines, heavy with ammo and hope, believing they were about to change the war. But as they taxied out for their first missions, the pilots noticed something. The controls felt sluggish. The tail felt heavy. The Wright Cyclone engines, the workhorses of the fleet, were growling a little deeper, working a little harder just to move the aircraft toward the runway. The Porcupine was ready to fight. The question was it ready to fly? The answer was written in the flight manuals, but it was the laws of physics that delivered the verdict, and they do not bargain. As soon as the wheels of the YB-40 left the concrete at Alconbury, the pilots realized they were wrestling a pig. The aircraft was heavy, grossing over 63,500 pounds at takeoff, fully 4,000 pounds heavier than the standard B-17 seconds flanking it. But in aviation, weight isn't just a number, it's a penalty. The first penalty was aerodynamic. A standard flying fortress was sleek, designed to slip through the thin air at high altitude, but the YB-40 was dirty. Every modification that made it lethal also made it unflyable. The massive chin turret under the nose disrupted the airflow before it even reached the wings. The second dorsal turret on the roof created a turbulent wake that hammered the vertical stabilizer. The protruding twin-gun mounts at the waist acted like air brakes. This is called parasitic drag, the resistance created by the aircraft's own skin and appendages. It was as if the YB-40 was flying with its landing gear down, fighting a constant, invisible headwind that the other bombers didn't have to endure. But the drag was manageable compared to the killer variable, wing loading. To understand why the YB-40 was doomed, you have to understand the metabolic cycle of a bomber mission. A standard B-17F takes off heavy, bloated with fuel and 6,000 pounds of high explosives. It labors up to altitude. But the moment it reaches the target, be it the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire or the rubber plants at Huls, it undergoes a radical physical transformation. Bombs away. In a split second, the standard bomber sheds 3 tons of dead weight. It instantly becomes lighter, more agile, and faster. The wing loading, the amount of weight each square foot of wing has to support, drops dramatically. The pilot can throttle back, save fuel, and still gain speed. The formation naturally accelerates as it turns for home, eager to put distance between itself and the flak. The YB-40 could not shed its weight. Its payload wasn't bombs. It was 11,000 rounds of lead and steel belts of ammunition. Unless the gunners fired every single round, which was impossible, the YB-40 stayed heavy. While the standard B-17 seconds were becoming racehorses after the bomb drop, the YB-40 remained a draft horse. This created a terrifying tactical paradox. To stay in formation with the now lightened bomber stream, the YB-40 pilot had to push his engines to the red line. He had to demand war emergency power from his 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, just to maintain cruise speed. The Cyclones were air-cooled beasts, designed to run hot, but not this hot. Running them at high manifold pressure for hours cooked the cylinders. The oil temperature gauges would creep past the safety limits. The cylinder head temperatures would spike. The center of gravity was also a nightmare. With thousands of rounds of ammo stored aft of the bomb bay, the YB-40 was tail-heavy. It wanted to pitch up, forcing the pilot to constantly push forward on the control column, fighting the aircraft's natural tendency to stall. The engineers at Douglas had warned about this. They knew the numbers didn't add up, but the brass wanted a solution, not a math problem. So, the YB-40 seconds flew. They flew into a trap where the enemy wasn't the Luftwaffe, but the mismatched energy states of their own formation. The flying destroyer was about to become the flying anchor. That anchor dropped on May 29, 1943, over the submarine pens of Saint-Nazaire. The mission profile for the 92nd Bomb Group seemed standard. The formation fought its way through the flak belt over the French coast. The YB-40 seconds tucked securely into the coffin corner, the vulnerable rear position of the low squadron. For the flight out, loaded with fuel and fear, the heavy gunships managed to hold their station. The standard B-17 seconds were heavy too, burdened by 6,000 pounds of high explosives, so the speed differential was negligible. But at 16.2, the lead bombardier looked through his Norden bomb sight and toggled the release switch. Bombs away. In a cascade of steel, the standard B-17 seconds instantly shed 3 tons of mass. The laws of physics took over immediately. Relieved of their burden, the bombers naturally pitched up, gaining 200 feet of altitude in seconds. Their airspeed bled into acceleration. The formation leader, eager to get out of the flak zone, nudged his throttles forward, settling into a lighter, faster cruise speed for the run home. Inside the cockpit of the YB-40, the pilot watched the formation slide away from him. He shoved his throttles to the stops. The 4 Wright Cyclones roared in protest, drinking fuel at a catastrophic rate. Manifold pressure 45 inches, RPM 2500. The pilot was demanding takeoff power at high altitude. It was engine suicide. He watched the cylinder head temperature gauge on the number 3 engine. The needle crept past the green arc, past the yellow caution range, and buried itself in the red 260 degrees Celsius. The engine was cooking itself. If the cylinder heads warped, the pistons would seize, the prop would stop, and the aircraft would become a glider. The flight engineer, standing behind the pilot's shoulder, tapped the glass of the temperature gauge. "Captain, she's gonna blow. You have to pull it back." This was the straggler's calculus. It was a binary choice with no survival option. Choice A, maintain power to stay with the protective formation, and blow an engine, which means you fall behind. Choice B, throttle back to save the engine, which means you fall behind. The pilot pulled the throttles back. The vibration in the airframe smoothed out, but the airspeed indicator dropped. 150 miles per hour. 145. Through the windscreen, the main formation of B-17 seconds became smaller. The distance opened up. 100 yards. 500. A mile. The combat box, that impenetrable geometric web of overlapping fire, was gone. The YB-40 was now alone in the sky. And in 1943, alone was a death sentence. High above, the pilots of Jagdgeschwader 2 were watching. The German aces were predators. They didn't attack the healthy herd. They looked for the weak, the sick, the slow. They saw the gap opening between the main force and the straggler. They saw the black smoke trailing from the YB-40's overworked engines. They rolled their Focke-Wulf 190 seconds inverted and dove. The intercom inside the YB-40 exploded with panic. Bandits, 6 o'clock high. 4 of them. The German tactic was to isolate the straggler and pick it apart piece by piece. They set up a coordinated bounce. 2 fighters would dive from the sun to draw the turret fire, while 2 more would come in level from the rear to smash the tail gunner. But as the Focke-Wulfs closed to 600 yards, they received a shock. This wasn't a wounded bird. The YB-40 lit up. The dorsal turret spun, the tail guns hammered, and the twin waist guns opened up a wall of tracers. The lead German fighter flew into a density of fire he had never experienced from a single bomber. He broke hard left, his canopy shattered, trailing smoke. For a moment, the concept worked. The Porcupine was doing exactly what it was designed to do, shredding fighters. But the victory was an illusion. The YB-40 was fighting for its life, but it wasn't doing its job. Its job was to escort the other bombers. Instead, the main formation was now 5 miles away, completely unprotected, while the escort was fighting a private war in the rear. The YB-40 crews found themselves in a running gun battle all the way to the channel. They were burning fuel at combat rates. The navigators were frantically calculating reserves, realizing they might not make the English coast. The gunners were standing knee-deep in spent brass, barrels glowing red-hot, screaming for more ammo belts. When the survivors finally limped back to Alconbury, the verdict was undeniable. The aircraft were riddled with holes. The engines were wrecked from the abuse. The crews were exhausted, their flight suits soaked in sweat and hydraulic fluid. They had shot down 5 German fighters. They had proven they could fight, but they had failed the mission. An escort that cannot keep up with the people it is supposed to protect is not an escort, it is a liability. The flying destroyer had become a target, draining resources and risking lives while the rest of the fleet flew on, as vulnerable as ever. The bomber mafia looked at the reports. They looked at the wrecked engines, and for the first time, they admitted that the experiment was a disaster. But amidst the wreckage of the program, the engineers sifting through the combat logs noticed something peculiar, something that happened in the first few seconds of the fight. That peculiar detail was buried in the debriefing reports of the waist gunners and bombardiers, a pattern so consistent it looked like a statistical anomaly. While the YB-42s were struggling to keep up, getting swarmed from the rear and sides, the crews reported a strange silence from the front. The deadly 12 o'clock high attacks, the tactic that was massacring the standard formations, had virtually ceased against the gunships. Every time a German pilot initiated a head-on run against a YB-40, something unprecedented happened. As he lined up his sights on the nose, expecting the usual helpless glass cockpit, he was met by a stream of 50 caliber tracers converging directly on his engine cowling. The Bendix chin turret didn't just return fire, it dominated the geometry of the engagement, facing a wall of lead that could track them through the dive. The Luftwaffe pilots flinched. They broke off their attacks early, rolling away before they could get into effective cannon range. The glass jaw had bitten back, but one tactical success couldn't save a strategic failure. By August 1943, the YB-40 program was bleeding money and morale. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the 8th Air Force, read the final assessment. The cost was staggering. $5.6 million sunk into aircraft that were slower than the fleet they were protecting. Of the original small batch, nearly half had been lost or damaged beyond repair, not by enemy fire, but by the sheer mechanical stress of trying to fly a brick. The order came down. Cancel the program. The surviving YB-42s were stripped of their glory. Most were relegated to training duties back in the States. A few were scrapped. The flying destroyer was dead. But in the hangars at Wright Field, the engineers weren't mourning the plane. They were dissecting the corpse. They realized that while the airframe was a failure because of its weight, the organs were masterpieces. The concept of the escort bomber was flawed, but the components were revolutionary. They looked at the B-17 production line, specifically the G model that was currently on the drawing board. The B-17G was supposed to be the definitive version of the Fortress, but it still lacked a solution for the frontal attack. The engineers made a decision that would change the course of the air war. They performed a firewall transplant. They took the Bendix Model A chin turret, the very heart of the failed YB-40, and bolted it directly onto the B-17G. It was an engineering salvage operation of the highest order. They reasoned that a standard bomber, carrying a normal bomb load and dropping it, wouldn't suffer the chronic weight penalties of the YB-40. The chin turret added weight, yes, but without the thousands of extra rounds of ammunition and the second dorsal turret, the B-17G could handle it. The result was immediate. In late 1943, the first B-17Gs began rolling off the assembly lines at Douglas, Vega, and Boeing. They looked different. The classic, smooth nose of the early war was gone, replaced by a pugnacious, jutting jaw. When these new bombers arrived in England, the veteran crews of the Bloody 100th and the 91st Bomb Group stared at them. They saw the chin turret and recognized it instantly. It was the ghost of the YB-40. The combat debut of the B-17G was a shock to the Luftwaffe. German pilots, accustomed to the vulnerable B-17F, launched their standard frontal intercept. They dove in from high noon, expecting an easy kill. Instead, they flew into a buzzsaw. The bombardiers in the G models, manipulating their remote control handles, sprayed the sky with accurate, stabilized fire. The radio chatter from German pilots changed. The easy frontal attack was suddenly a suicide run. The loss rates from head-on passes dropped precipitously. The B-17G wasn't an escort bomber, it was just a bomber. But thanks to the failure of the YB-40, it was a bomber that could finally look the enemy in the eye. The YB-40 had failed as a protector, but in its death, it had donated the organ that would save the species. The Porcupine had taught the Army Air Forces exactly what worked, and more importantly, exactly what didn't. And as the B-17Gs formed their massive armadas in 1944, darkening the skies over Berlin, every single one of them carried a piece of the failure that made them invincible. The legacy of the YB-40 wasn't written in the history books as a victory. It was written in the survival of thousands of 10-man crews who came home because a failed experiment had proven that the only way to fix a glass jaw is to bolt a gun to it. But the YB-40 wasn't the only technological mutant born from desperation. While the bombers were learning to defend themselves, the fighter pilots were about to get a Frankenstein monster of their own, a hybrid creature born from a Texas airframe and a British heart that would finally hunt the Luftwaffe to extinction. But until that hybrid hunter arrived in force, the bomber crews were still fighting for their lives in the freezing slipstream, and they did it in a machine that was the direct descendant of the failed YB-40 experiment. By the winter of 1943, the 8th Air Force was no longer fielding a ragtag fleet of disparate models. They were consolidating around a single, definitive airframe, the B-17G. To the untrained eye, it looked like just another flying fortress. But to the mechanics and gunners who ran their hands over the cold aluminum, the G model was a collection of lessons learned in blood during the YB-40's brief, disastrous tenure. The failed gunship had acted as a high-velocity stress test, revealing ergonomic flaws that peacetime engineers had never imagined. The first lesson was found in the waist of the aircraft. On the older B-17F, the port and starboard waist gunners stood directly across from each other. In the chaos of combat, with the floor slick with hydraulic fluid and the fuselage rocking from flak bursts, they were constantly colliding. Combat reports from the YB-40, which had tried to jam even more hardware into that cramped space, proved that two men fighting back-to-back couldn't track targets effectively. They were physically blocking each other's range of motion. Boeing's solution for the B-17G was elegant in its simplicity: the staggered waist. They moved the starboard gun mount forward and the port mount back. It created a dedicated combat zone for each gunner. They could now swing their .50 calibers through a full range of motion without elbows clashing or tethers tangling. It was a minor structural change that yielded a massive tactical dividend in fire discipline. The second lesson came from the tail. The YB-40 tail gunners had reported that their standard Stinger position offered terrible visibility. The windows were too small, the armor plate too restrictive, and the gun mount too stiff to track a fighter diving at 400 miles per hour. The YB-40 proved that a blind tail gunner is just a passenger. In response, the Army Air Forces contracted the United Airlines Modification Center in Cheyenne, Wyoming, to radically redesign the rear of the bomber. The result was the Cheyenne tail. It was wider, shorter, and fitted with large panes of armored glass that opened up the field of view. It used a reflector sight instead of the old ring and bead, and the gun mount was completely reworked to allow for rapid traverse. Now, the tail end Charlie could see the enemy coming, and more importantly, he could hit them. But the crown jewel of the B-17G, the feature that earned it the title Queen of the Skies, was the inheritance from the nose of the YB-40. The Bendix chin turret was no longer an experiment. It was standard equipment. With the chin turret, the staggered waist, and the Cheyenne tail, the B-17G was the most heavily armed bomber of World War II. It bristled with 13 .50 caliber machine guns, and unlike the YB-40, it could carry this firepower and a full load of bombs and keep up with the formation. The statistical impact of this evolution was stark. In early 1943, a frontal attack on a B-17 formation was a calculated risk for a German pilot. By mid-1944, it was suicide. The glass jaw had been plated over with twin machine guns. Intelligence reports intercepted from Luftwaffe airfields told the story. German veteran pilots were warning the rookies to stay away from the nose of the new fortresses. The geometry of the kill had shifted. The B-17G went on to become the icon of the strategic bombing campaign. It dropped 640,000 tons of bombs on Europe. It flew through the flak of Berlin, the oil smoke of Ploesti, and the jet-filled skies of 1945. But its dominance wasn't born on a drawing board in Seattle. It was born in the failure of the YB-40. Innovation in war is rarely a straight line from concept to perfection. It is a messy, violent loop of trial and error. The YB-40 was a $5.6 million mistake, a Frankenstein monster that couldn't fly right. But sometimes, you have to build the monster to find the parts that work. You have to push a concept until it breaks, until the engines overheat, and the drag becomes unbearable to understand the limits of the possible. The YB-40 died so the B-17G could live. And because the G model lived, 10,000 men who might have died in the shattered noses of F models came home to their families. The flying destroyer was a failure, but it was a successful failure. And in the unforgiving arithmetic of total war, that is often the only kind of victory that matters. To see another failed idea that revolutionized combat, you need to look no further than the P-51 Mustang itself, a plane that the British initially rejected and the Americans didn't want, until a rogue engineer decided to swap its heart. But that heart transplant was still months away, and in the interim, the YB-40 crews had to hold the line with nothing but grit and a flawed machine. When the program was officially terminated in August 1943, the physical erasure of the flying destroyer was almost immediate. The surviving aircraft were flown back to the United States and stripped of the very teeth that defined them. The massive ammunition boxes were torn out of the bomb bays. The extra armor was removed. The experimental turrets were unbolted. These 12 aircraft, which had cost the taxpayers $5.6 million and carried the hopes of the entire bomber command, were relegated to the humiliating role of gunnery trainers. They spent the rest of the war circling safe airfields in Florida and Texas, towing targets for rookies, far from the flak and the freezing terror of the Reich. Of the original service test batch, not a single YB-40 survives today. They were chopped up for scrap, melted down into aluminum ingots, and likely recycled into the skin of the very B-17Gs that replaced them. In the eyes of the bean counters in Washington, the project was a total loss, a statistical zero. But history is not an accountant, it is a judge. And by the judgment of the men who flew in 1944, the YB-40 was the most successful failure of the war. If you walk into a museum today, perhaps the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, and stand beneath the nose of the B-17G shoo 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 baby, you are not just looking at a standard bomber. You are looking at the scar tissue of a desperate experiment. That chin turret gleaming under the museum lights is the physical proof of the rebellious innovation loop. The Army Air Forces had to build the wrong plane to find the right parts. They had to push the concept of the gunship to its absolute breaking point until the engines cooked and the aerodynamics failed to isolate the one variable that actually mattered, the remote-controlled firepower in the nose. Without the YB-40, there is no B-17G. Without the B-17G and its ability to defeat the frontal attack, the daylight bombing campaign might have collapsed in late 1943 under the weight of unsustainable losses. The 12 crews who flew those lead sleds into combat, who watched their formations pull away while they fought for their lives as stragglers, did not suffer in vain. They were the test pilots of a doctrine that saved thousands of their brothers. They proved that you cannot cheat physics with more guns, but you can solve a tactical puzzle if you are willing to fail fast, fail hard, and salvage the pieces that work. The YB-40 solved the problem of defense. It patched the glass jaw. But it could not solve the problem of offense. It could not chase the Luftwaffe back to its airfields and kill it on the ground. To do that, the Allies didn't need a bomber that tried to be a fighter. They needed a fighter that could fly like a bomber. They needed a plane that was currently languishing in British hangars, unloved and underpowered, rejected by the very services it would eventually save. They needed a Texas airframe, a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and a rogue engineer willing to ignore the experts. If you want to see how the little friend finally arrived to clear the skies, make sure you are subscribed. Next time, we are going to deconstruct the P-51 Mustang, not the legend you know, but the mechanical impossibility that barely escaped the scrap heap to win the war. If this deep dive into the forgotten tragedy of the YB-40 gave you a new respect for the crews of 1943, hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm that these stories matter. And I want to know your verdict in the comments. Was the YB-40 a waste of resources, or was it the necessary price of admission for the B-17G?